Well, the story begins in high school, but as it does with most people, where I first read Romeo and Juliet and disliked it exceedingly, and found it inaccessible. And I think part of it was the way it was presented to us. And I just thought, oh, I really don't have a lot of time for this guy. I really wasn't that interested. And then when I got into university and I was doing my undergrad, I became an English major because I thought I wanted to study American literature. And then I met Shakespeare, really. And I got into the works very deeply. I was really interested in Hamlet. Was the first play that I probably really understood and really resonated with me a lot. Partly because I had gone through a few of my own losses at that point, and it was really a moving experience for me to read that play. And what I realized was this person has something to say that I want to know about. I want to hear more. So that got me into eventually studying Renaissance literature and getting a PhD in it. So I think that maybe the first thing I would say is know that he's not stuffy. There's nothing boring about Shakespeare once you get going. It's full of violence and sex and all kinds of exciting things, but also the things that we connect with on a human level in all of the media that we consume. I would also say give it a chance to soak in. It's not going to be a first read and you're going to have it down and be connecting with it on a deep level. It takes time, repetition, and the use of the resources that are out there. Many summaries exist of all of the plays online, and I really encourage students to mine that resource, and then to go back to read the plays with that plot sort of there, and then that allows for one to identify, oh, this is where that happens. This is where that happens. And as you sort of understand the plot, then you can enjoy the language better. And just like I say about reading anything difficult, it takes more than once, and it takes a little bit of percolation time. One, I think, has to just leave it alone for a while sometimes and then come back to it. But eventually, it pays big dividends. It's almost like the level of difficulty is equal to the level of reward. Actually, King Lear. I really love King Lear. I hadn't really fully engaged with it until I was in graduate school, and once I got into it, I realized I think this is just my humble opinion, but I think it's actually a better play than Hamlet. It's full of beautiful poetry and astonishing acts of kindness, and it has soul to it that I think some of the other plays have a little less of, and it just really resonates with me. Decent company when I say that, and yep. many people have found themselves sort of saying this is the one. And it's interesting because it hasn't always been considered his greatest. In fact, there was a time in the 18th century and into part of the 19th century where it was found to be unbearable to watch in its form, in the form that it's presented in the quartos and the folio, and because of all the tragedy at the end, that everybody dies. And so there was a revision of it so that instead of Cordelia dying tragically and Albany and Edgar sort of going on, she marries Edgar. Cordelia marries Edgar, and they all live happily ever after, right? So, I mean, and we can reading about that now, one sort of laughs a little bit because it's like, how silly, because that's not how the play really ends, and it's not supposed to be that way. But one can see why, because of the sensibilities of that time and the sort of intolerance for ugly things, mm-hmm. right, difficult things. A fellow called Charles Lamb in 1811 says that the play is essentially impossible to be represented on the stage, preferring to experience it in the study. He preferred to experience it in the study. In the theater, he argues, to see Lear acted, to see an old man tottering about the stage with a walking stick, turned out of doors by his daughters on a rainy night, has nothing in it but what is painful and disgusting. So he really felt like it was better to read than to see.
Yeah.
And I think he's correct in some ways. It is easier to read, certainly, than to see. But I think that the seeing of it is important, because seeing and not seeing, sight and sightlessness, are such a thematic part of the play anyway. And one of the things that happens to us as we're watching it on stage is that we are tempted to turn away. We're tempted to close our eyes to what is happening in front of us. But that's the fatal mistake that many of the characters have made. And so as an audience, it behooves us to look and to take in what's happening, but the tragedy that's happening on the stage, however graphic it is. I think the truth is what he wants us to see, and the truth is complicated. The truth is not having people flatter you endlessly. The truth is not personal power that is endless, and we are all vulnerable. No one is invulnerable, and I think that's one of the things he wants us to see. I think he also wants us to see that what we believe to be happening can often be incorrect, that we can allow ourselves to fail to see by seeing what someone else is pushing on us, which is the case that we see play out actually with Gloucester and Edmund and Edgar, where Gloucester's moral blindness is essentially used by his son Edmund in order to try to disinherit Edgar. So I just think he wants us to, and there's also there are all these images of lightness and darkness, and I think that's part of the answer as well, that when things come to light, literally, when the dark of the storm is over, right, and when Lear starts to recover himself, that's when we're able to kind of see aright. We're able to correct ourselves and to say what needs to be said in a sincere manner. Well, I think first, of course, perhaps not of course, but I think first of Cordelia, because her name comes from cordis, which is Latin for heart, and she is the heart of the play. She's the character that forms the kind of moral center of the play. And she sheds light on something early in the play that Lear doesn't want to see, which is that his two older daughters are simply buttering him up, telling him what he wants to hear, and that they don't have the true feelings that Cordelia has. And she may go a little too far in being sort of, in refusing to play this game that he's playing with the love test. Tell me which of you doth love me most. I mean, this is such a horrible thing to do to your children, right? But she has the sight to say what needs to be said and to sit with having given this reproof both to her father and to her two older sisters. It's essentially a reproof. It's essentially saying, I know exactly what you two are doing. And Dad, I know what you're doing too, which is simply asking for a sort of narcissistic refill of your sense of importance. And so she refuses to play that game, and that is a light. And then I think Kent is another character who I think of as a bright point in the play, where he, with Cordelia, says, Lear, what are you doing? This is madness.
See better.
see better Lear.
Mm-hmm.
Right, exactly. And Kent will be, I think he says, Kent will be mad when Lear is blind, while Lear is blind. Some words to that effect. And I think Edgar is a shining star, and I mean, just a very beautiful character in so many ways. He goes, in a sense, he goes beyond what Cordelia does by coming back to the very man who banished him and trying to alleviate his suffering, despite the fact that on a certain level, Gloucester could be said to have brought some of his suffering on himself, right? By playing favorites and by falling for Edmund's ruse, in which he makes it look like Edgar's trying to kill him so that he can inherit land right away. And so there's, I think those are the three that come to mind first. And I don't think it's any surprise that two of them are actually disguised in part of the play as part of their work to be decent human beings. They have to pretend to be somebody else briefly. So it's one of Shakespeare's wonderful paradoxes where the most true characters are two characters who costume themselves differently and speak with a different accent and do all these things to kind of cover up who they actually are, and yet are the most, two of the most true characters in the play. It's a great question. I feel like part of it has to do with he understands so well the power of theater. He understands so well the power of putting on a costume and pretending to be someone else, and the emptying out of the self that entails. That you have to sort of set aside what your natural inclinations are to some degree. You present yourself as a different person, and that there's a kind of truth to that anyway, right? That's, again, it's paradoxical, because what I think Shakespeare did his entire life was to speak the truth on the stage, which is inherently artificial and untrue, but he did that nonetheless, right? So I feel like that's part of it. But also another part of it was just a cultural emphasis on the fact that clothes really do make the man in this period. I mean, there were laws about who could wear what, the sumptuary laws, and so if you were out impersonating an aristocrat, that was a very serious crime, and you could be in a lot of trouble for it. At the same time, actors had license to do this for a few hours in the afternoon at the Globe on a regular basis, or at the Rose, or at the theater earlier, and so they were also marginalized people in Elizabethan and Jacobean society. Actors were thought of as in league and the same level with thieves and whores and other sort of
lower class.
Yes, undesirables, right? But which seems so strange now, given that we are so sort of enamored of actors now, and we put them in pretty high esteem. But I just think that Shakespeare was thinking about sometimes you have to become someone else to understand yourself, who you actually are. Edmund, in his speech about being an illegitimate son, I think, gives us a good just slice of what it would mean to be a slightly more modern thinking person in this period. It was one who rejected the older models of knowledge, such as the model of knowledge that said that the stars could tell you about, the future.
Astrology influencing human endeavors.
Yes, and different aspects of magic. And Edmund is a little bit more of a modern fellow, but that's also one of the dark aspects of him, is that he goes so far with that he becomes hard. He becomes without without the sentiment that is required to make one a full human, right? So he says thou, and here when he says nature, he's talking about the term of natural, a natural child, which was a term for a child that was illegitimate. And he says, thou nature art my goddess, to thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me? So in other words, why should I have to put up with other people and the custom of saying that I'm somehow not legitimate, right? For that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother. I'm only about a year different from Edgar's age. Why bastard? Wherefore base? When my dimensions are as well compact, my mind as generous, and my shape as true as honest madam's issue, why brand they us with base, with baseness, bastardy? Base? Base? Who in the lusty stealth of nature take more composition and fierce quality than doth within a dull, stale, tired bed go to the creating a whole tribe of fops, got tween asleep and awake? Well then, legitimate Edgar, I must have your land. So, I mean, he sees clearly about this in a way, because I think a lot of people would say today there's no such thing as an illegitimate child. Children are not illegitimate. All children are legitimate. And that he is disinherited simply because of his origin seems also unjust. But what he does then is he goes to a kind of extreme conclusion, which is, since that's unjust, I'm going to ruin my legitimate brother and take away his title and land completely. And it's greed. I mean, he's greedy. That's his darkness, I think, is greed and over much an excessive reliance on rationality, which can be so very good in so many situations, but without feeling, it's a way to be sort of obtuse to people's needs and to be insensitive, essentially, which he is in a very epic way. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I think they're greedy. I think they like lovely clothes, and they like big land, and they like being queens of those lands, and they just want that. I mean, that's one of their primary vices, and I think also lust we see later with their infatuation with Edmund and their competition over him. That they also, some of their darkness comes from there. The Fool's really important. I feel like he is a sort of crystallization of what people thought about madness at the time, what they thought madness was, or what they thought a clown was, what they thought was funny. But he's also a little pressure valve that says the things that the audience is thinking and wanting to yell at Lear, like, what have you done? And calling attention to injustice and problematic relationships between Lear and his daughters. I think that's one of his functions, but I also think he's present before Lear goes completely mad. And when Lear goes completely mad, he's no longer present, as if Lear becomes his own fool at that point. And then, as Lear begins to recover, is when his other fool appears, who's Cordelia, and it's because of her, partly. But he's sort of, it's as if to say, we're all fools. We all always have that fool standing by to either tell us the truth of what we're doing that's incredibly stupid, or to just remind us of our own faults, just sort of shake things up a little bit and make us think differently. think part of it, I mean, it's that passage in which he says that without having all of the accoutrements of culture, without our clothes, without our houses, we are no more than such bare forked creatures when we're unaccommodated man. And so I think he's trying to draw attention to the fact that we are creatures, that we do have physical needs, and that when we are bereft of those things, they become incredibly precious. And we stop thinking about things like, how much land do I have? How much status do I have? I just want a nice place to lie down and get warm. I mean, that it gets to that sort of basic aspect of human existence. The body itself is kind of where this play ends in a way. The body giving out after being so tested and abused, as I think is the case with Lear, that he dies of a broken heart. And literally, he dies of a broken heart because he's holding Cordelia in his arms in this reverse pietà, right? It looks like
the Virgin and the Christ.
Of Mary holding Christ, you know, and comes out and howl, right? And then I think he just bodily, and his heart just cracks. And in fact, somebody says lines to that effect. So I think that's why. I think that's one of the reasons. And then another reason is that we might think, you know, more kindly about animals. You know, that we might think more positively about our likenesses with animals. But yes, usually the use of animal imagery is to insult his daughters. So there's that problem. His first appearance is that he's there to, meantime we shall express our darker purpose, he says. That's his very first or second thing he says. So we're here to discuss our darker purpose. It's as if Shakespeare's saying Lear is in the dark, right? And then gradually will, of course, have to be driven mad to get out of the dark. His going out on the heath, and what this is interesting because, just a little side note, that we have traditionally thought of him ending up in the storm on the heath, but nowhere in the play does it say the word heath, which is kind of funny. But in any case, when he ends up outdoors, in the elements, in the storm, I think what's happening is that the madness that was already there when he was asking his daughters to have a contest over who could say the nicest things to him, I think that madness starts to truly take over. But it's at the very same time he's slowly getting a sense of, okay, clearly Goneril and Regan did not mean anything that they said. I wonder about that third daughter of mine, Cordelia, who I banished. Wonder about her. And then eventually he's, I think, broken to pieces. I feel like that storm, and I think that treatment by his two daughters deconstructs him. And he is literally cracking up. And then I think what happens is that he eventually gets to reassemble. And the reassembly is as a new person. So it's almost a fortunate fall or a felix culpa, where the individual has to make the big mistake and then come back from it more humble, a better man, seeing clearly in order to go forward, which for him just ends up being to his death. But there's a kind of and there's a kind of a sense of divine providence in this play, even though it repeatedly refers to pagan gods, and the gods rather than the god. But it's there. So I almost feel like that is exactly right. Yes, and I would go back to the fortunate fall. I mean, he's someone who needs to be scraped up a little bit by life in order to wake up. Yeah.
Do you think Shakespeare is saying that each of us need to experience suffering to get into a deeper, more compassionate sense of ourselves?
I do. I do. Because how do we extend compassion to other people if we haven't figured out how it feels, for one thing, to have bad luck, bad turns, pain, loss, etc., without, going through it ourselves? How do we address it in other people? How do we help other people through that? And then there's a kind of self-effacement in those events that also leads one to look outward and to see the humanity all around us. And the suffering that we don't always know is there. And to, with, theory of mind, to be able to think that person must have also an internal landscape, and what are they going through? What are they thinking about? What's hurting them right now?
Mm-hmm.
It is, and it's the wonderful moment when he says, I've given too little thought to this, right? The problem of people who are out in storms like this every time there's a storm like this, that there are people who have nothing in the kingdom, and I've given too little thought to it, and now I am that. I am in that position, and it takes him actually losing everything to see this. But I think that's because he's a pretty proud man at the beginning, and has built an almost impenetrable wall of self-importance around himself. He's hard to reach, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as if this has to happen to him.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think at that moment he sees something aright for the first time.
That's kind of when he begins to become human.
Yes.
Instead of a god.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, even when he first is outside, right? He's still trying to command. He's trying to command the weather, and he's ordering it to be more tempestuous even than it is. He says, blow wind and crack your cheeks, rage blow, you cataracts and hurricanos, spout till you have drenched our steeples, and so forth. It's almost as if he's saying, I feel so upended in my own mind that I want to see that refigured on the landscape. I want everything to reflect that I'm going mad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's shortly thereafter that he becomes pretty nonsensical. Well, one thing, I mean, nothing was slang for women's genitals. So the fact that Lear is constructing his two older daughters as these, horrible hags with, and attributing that to their femininity largely. I mean, there's a lot of, very sort of misogynist speech that he engages in parts of the play. I think that's part of it, the nothing. And thing was the opposite, was for slang for men's genitalia. And so I think there's something there about lechery, because we have Gloucester's missteps in the past that have led to his illegitimate son being born. And we have Edgar, as poor Tom, saying that was his primary problem, was that he was lecherous. Right, and so I think that's part of it. But another part of it, I think, is it's being a nothingness. I can't say that Shakespeare was an existentialist, but I think he's thinking about what about this thing we think of as existence? What is human consciousness really? Is there nothing? Is there a precipice off of which we may really fall? And it is the precipice at which we all stand all the time, if the existentialists were right, kind of making a decision to go on, right? And so that, of course, is I think an echo of the scene in which Edgar leads his father to the pretend cliff, and his father pretend jumps off of it, and then is miraculously saved, right? And that scene could be goofy. I mean, it could come off really badly, but for some reason it works, and I think part of it is the poetry of it. But back to the whole thing about nothing. I think the play is about having and not having. It's about having nothing and having everything, and it's about being nothing and thinking one is everything. And it has so much resonance that I couldn't even really plumb all of the ways in which it's important, but it's very much a theme and a motif in the play. Especially to the Christian believer, a lot of this stuff will stand out. Echoes of scripture in here. At one point, Cordelia says, "I go about my Father's business," and it's an echo of, I want to say, Luke, where Christ says to Mary and Joseph, "Don't you know I'm going about my Father's business here?" We've also got the first shall be last, the last shall be first. When you have Lear sort of inviting everybody else into the hovel before himself, and then you have a lot of other moments of sort of scriptural sounding lines. That when France says to Cordelia, "Fairest Cordelia, thou art most rich, being poor, most choice forsaken, and most loved despised. Thee and thy virtues here I seize upon, be it lawful. I take up what's cast away, God's gods, 'tis strange, that from their cold neglect my love should kindle to an inflamed respect. Thy dowerless daughter came, thrown to my chance, is queen of us, of ours, and of our fair France." So this, is that reversal that's so often spoken of in the Gospels. So there's that, but there's also, I think, in terms of just spirituality, and I don't necessarily think one has to be a believer either to appreciate the beauty of this language. It stands on its own, and I think that there is a set rather of sort of spiritual truths here that one has to set oneself aside sometimes and stop thinking selfishly and do the right thing, which is very rarely that comfortable, right? I don't think Cordelia is comfortable at all, for instance, in the opening scene when she says, "I love you exactly as much as I need to love you as your daughter, and no more, no less." I don't think that's comfortable for her, but I also think it's what she feels she needs to do. And
what is her truth in that moment?
Exactly. But then we do get her kind of learning a lesson there too, because by the end, he says, your sisters are, have cursed me, and you probably also have some curses for me, and you would want to, punish me somehow for what I've done. And she says immediately, no need. And she says something. She uses speech there, and that leads me to another thing that I'm fascinated by in this play, which is the point at which language is no longer functioning. It's those moments of silence, say nothing. Cordelia saying nothing, the word nothing being repeated, and then the repetition of those exclamatory statements by Lear toward the end, where he says, "Howl, howl, howl." I mean, it's as if Shakespeare's trying to capture the very most animal aspect of humans in pain. Just a cry instead of poetry, instead of the other very beautiful poetry that's there. It's simply howl, howl, howl. I mean, it makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you see it. And And there are several points at which the language does break down, especially there with Lear. He says, "Oh, oh, oh, oh," so that those repeated words sort of start to lose their meaning a little bit in their repetition. But that's not even the point. The point is this is a man in excruciating pain, expressing that pain. I do think that. I think if we see only with the mind, as Edmund does at the beginning, if we see only with cold rationality, we're not going to see the whole picture. I think the end is one of my favorite sets of lines, partly because of how it kind of gives us the instruction of what are we meant to do with this now? Where do we go from here? And Kent has shown up and he says, "I have a journey, sir, shortly to go. My master calls me, I must not say no." And that master could be Lear, who's just died, or it could be, his god that he's going to. But it's Kent standing right at that precipice, knowing that his death is on its way, and simply saying, "I have to go. I'm not going to be here." On the other hand, we have Edgar saying, "The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. The oldest have borne most. We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long." And that, I feel, is speaking to everyone in every audience, in every reader, and saying, if you have life left to live, we that are young, right? We have things to do, such as speaking what we feel, not what is proper to say, right? There are times when one has to say the thing that no one wants to hear, and also to look up to and see what our elders have seen and have kind of honor for that, which is something too that this brings up the notion of elder care. I mean, it makes you think of what do I do when I find that my parents are, when one is faced with aging parents, what is the right thing to do? This play is about that too, and it's about the fact that being young enough, I don't feel like I'm part of the group of young anymore, but being young enough to do something, you have a responsibility. We have a responsibility, right?
Mm-hmm.